Hey guys, so I have a competition coming up soon, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, what I'm doing here, what you're seeing, is a big session, and then at the end of the video, I'll show the average of 5 that I do after that session. So essentially, the purpose behind this is to tire myself out by doing a regular session like I normally do, and then once I'm kind of not able to do solves as fast as like the beginning or middle of the session, then I decide, okay, I'm going to stop the session here and just do one average of 5. And that average of 5 is the only one I get for the day, and that's the only thing that matters out of any of this. So the goal behind it basically is to kind of simulate the average of 5 in a competition, because I will also be tired, I also will have done a bunch of solves, and I need to gather my focus for just 5 solves only. So you'll see that average as the last part of the video, and this part is just the main session that I did before the average. Anyway, so about the competition, it's on June 10th and is called Vancouver something. It's being hosted by Anthony Brooks, and so I checked the registration a few days ago. Of course, we have Anthony Brooks going, but there's also Kevin Hayes, and there's also some other notable cubers, so you can go check out the registration for that. I'll put a link to the competition in the description. So a question I get a lot is, how do you practice look ahead? And so the first thing I want to say is, if you average like sub 30 or maybe 25, I'm not sure where exactly the mark is, but somewhere around there, maybe even sub 20, look ahead is not the important thing to practice in F2L. Instead, you should be trying to find efficient ways to do all your F2L cases and then get those into your muscle memory. The thing is with practicing look ahead is you have to think. And if you're thinking about how to do certain moves to make your F2L efficient, you can't think about look ahead instead. So that's why muscle memory for efficient F2L pairings is really important, and you don't get that until maybe sub 25 or 20 or maybe even 15 if some of your F2L cases are not that efficient. But anyway, the number one most important thing for practicing look ahead is to make sure you don't look at the current pair you're doing. Trust that your muscle memory can take care of that and actively look away from it. I already have a video completely on F2L look ahead, and if you haven't seen it, there's a link in the description. I think it's one of my more useful videos. So in there I talk about what to look for and how to practice, such as like where should you look and so on. But I also say how you should do untimed solves and not necessarily slow solves, because if your solves are too slow, then look ahead is too easy and you're not improving. But if it's too fast, then you can't look ahead and you won't even improve your look ahead at all that way. So of course, then you need to find a balance where it's challenging to do F2L without pausing, but you could still kind of do it. But it's not as simple as that. You need to think about what you're doing when you practice that. And so for example, if you always have front slots that are solved and your back slots are not solved, and that's why you couldn't see any pieces, then maybe you should be asking yourself why your back slots are always unsolved. And I talk about front slot, back slot stuff in that video as well. Then another thing that happens like less often, but it's still kind of important, is when you have diagonal slots unsolved. And what happens with that is you can't have them both on the same side. One of them will have to be at the back, which makes it hard to look ahead in some cases. It's not always, but like let's say you have slotted pieces in both of those diagonal slots, then it's going to be really hard to look ahead to what those pieces are. Then a problem with untimed solves that kind of is discouraging is after I practice it, I go back to regular timed solves and I realize that I'm slower. And I'm not always slower, sometimes I'm faster, but I find that more often I'm slower and I have to feel like I'm improving back up to where I was before I did untimed solve practice. And that doesn't make any sense because untimed solves is a good thing and I'm gaining knowledge while I do it. I'm gaining knowledge about what my look ahead weaknesses are and how to improve on that. So why am I slower? And the reason is because of thinking. So you might remember the first time you learned F2L, you were probably slower at F2L than you were at the beginner method. And that's because the beginner method's easy for you and didn't require any thinking. And F2L did require thinking. Humans are slow at thinking, therefore you got slower. But you did learn something new and eventually you became a lot faster at knowing F2L. So this is kind of the same thing. Anytime you learn something new, expect to get slower at first, because once you gain new knowledge, you have to use that knowledge. And using knowledge requires you to think and be slow, but then getting fast at using that knowledge requires a lot of practice. So every time you do untimed solves practice, anytime you do good practice, essentially what happens when you learn new things is you kind of raise the ceiling on how good you can get. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get closer to your potential. It just means you now have more potential. So you need to put in work to practice all that, make sure what you know becomes subconscious, that you don't have to think about it so much, and that's when you'll get faster. So remember, knowing more doesn't always mean you'll be faster, but if you practice what you know, it'll become subconscious, and then that's when you'll get faster. Then the last thing I want to talk about is intuition. So when you do this sort of practice, another thing you gain is intuition. So when you do a certain F2L pair and you're wondering where the next F2L pair will be, like what case exactly it will be, you can't really track through all that in your head in an instant. But if you watch the pieces move, eventually you'll just kind of get a feel for where they're going to go and what cases they'll probably set up into. Now, this obviously takes a lot of time because it's not the same as building knowledge. This is building intuition, which is something that is really hard to actively work towards, but it's something that everyone gains as a result of doing a lot of active thinking while practicing. But you also gain it when doing unconscious practicing, like when you're just doing a big session where you're not really thinking at all. So that's probably like one of the biggest reasons why, even if you don't think you're doing well, practice is like almost always good practice. Like unless you're doing bad habits, your practice is probably really useful because you always gain little bits of information. Even if you can't tell it's happening, intuition is really, really important because it basically happens instantly. It's not like concrete pieces of knowledge where you start out being really slow at it, then you have to train it up to be really fast. Instead, you kind of get really small bits of it at a time. And as you practice over months or even years, when you deduce where certain pieces will be, it'll just be a little bit more obvious. Like I see one sticker, I know what piece it is. And that may not be obvious to someone just starting out, and you may not be able to explain why you can do that, but a lot of top level improvement is just basically that. So always remember, when you practice, it's good practice. All right, so that's all I wanted to talk about for this video, except for one more thing, which is that average of 5 I mentioned in the beginning. So I did one big session to tire myself out and then regathered my focus for just one average of 5. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.